The scent of expensive tobacco and impending violence always arrived before Li Gan did. The city air outside was thick with rain, but inside the gold-leafed lounge, the atmosphere was suffocating for a different reason. Maria Blue moved through the room with the practiced invisibility of a ghost. At 30, she had mastered the art of being a shadow, a necessary skill for a woman with a past the government wanted to forget. She refilled crystal glasses and cleared porcelain plates, her eyes downcast, though she saw every exit, every hidden weapon, and every nervous twitch of the high-profile guests. Tonight, the air held a static charge, like the moment before a storm breaks. Across the lounge, Li Gan commanded the center table. Sharp-suited and lethal, the dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to pulse in the candlelight. He was a man who ruled through blood and silence, and tonight, he had chosen a target for his boredom, the waitress. "Look at this one," Li Gan sneered in rapid, sharp Korean to his lieutenants, his voice dripping with seasonal cruelty. "A lowly bird pretending she belongs in a room like this. Black skin, empty head, she doesn't even know she's being mocked." His men erupted into jagged, mocking laughter. Maria's pulse didn't skip, but her eyes caught something the Mafia boss missed. A tiny, blood-red dot was dancing across the navy blue silk of his chest, moving toward his heart. The light originated from the darkened service window of the kitchen. Invisibility was about to shatter. Maria stepped forward, violating the unspoken rule of the lounge by entering Li Gan's personal space. She leaned down, her lips inches from the boss's ear, and whispered two words in perfect Korean, "Jigum." "Jogyeok, now." "Sniper." Li Gan's eyes went wide, his mouth falling open as he felt the sudden, icy chill of the laser's heat. The insignificant waitress had just become the most powerful person in the room. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you are listening from. Let's begin. The scent of expensive tobacco and impending violence always arrived before Li Gan did. Inside the gold-leafed lounge, the atmosphere was suffocating, thick with the smell of rain from the Chicago streets and the sharp metallic tang of Li Gan's arrogance. Maria Blue moved through the room with practiced invisibility, a shadow in a crisp white shirt and a red apron, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail that betrayed nothing of her past. She refilled crystal glasses with a steady hand, her eyes downcast as she approached the center table where the lion waited. Li Gan sat like a king in a navy blue suit, the dragon tattoo coiling up his neck catching the golden light of the chandeliers. He didn't acknowledge Maria's presence as she poured the mineral water, but his voice suddenly cut through the soft jazz of the room like a jagged blade. He spoke in high-level, formal Korean, the Haeoche style, a dialect reserved for elite circles, intended to elevate himself while burying her in a language he assumed she couldn't grasp. "Look at the way it moves," Li Gan sneered, his eyes tracing the red laser dot that Maria alone had noticed dancing across his chest. He leaned back, laughing a cold, dismissive sound that made his lieutenants join in with jagged synchronicity. "It thinks it is human because it wears the uniform of a civilized establishment. A lowly bird from the dirt, chirping for tips while we discuss the fate of empires." His words were meticulously chosen, dripping with a seasonal, calculated cruelty that attacked Maria's heritage and her status as a service dog. He turned his glass, watching the light refract off the water, oblivious to the silent precision of the red dot resting over his heart. "They are all the same," he continued in that melodic, lethal tongue. "Obedient because they have no choice. born to serve those of us who possess the sun. Maria's pulse didn't skip, and her hand remained stone-cold steady as she set the bottle down. She felt the ancient, furious heat ignited in her chest, the same fire she had spent years trying to forget, but she maintained her mask of pleasant neutrality. Li Gan looked directly through her, his gaze as predatory and fascinated as a cat watching a wounded sparrow, never suspecting that the insignificant woman before him understood every syllable of his scorn. He believed he was safe behind a wall of culture and class, but as the laser stabilized on his navy lapel, Maria realized the lion was about to find out that the bird he was mocking was the only thing standing between him and the silence of the grave. Maria's eyes remained fixed on the porcelain rim of Li Gan's plate, but the gilded walls of the lounge began to dissolve into the gray, rain-slicked concrete of a black site training facility in Payu. Before she was Maria Blue, she had been Asset 742, a ghost drafted into a joint ops program that specialized in deep cover infiltration within the Pacific Rim. The Korean she knew wasn't learned from textbooks or casual conversation. It had been beaten into her during 18-hour immersion sessions where the cost of a misplaced syllable was a week without sleep. She remembered the scent of ozone and the hum of fluorescent lights in a basement room where a hard-faced instructor had forced her to recite Gyeongsangdo poetry until her throat bled. They hadn't just taught her the language, they had taught her to inhabit the soul of the culture, to understand the subtle shifts in honorifics that signaled a man's intent to kill long before he reached for a blade. Her military-grade observation skills weren't a gift, but a scar, a byproduct of years spent memorizing the ballistic patterns of high-velocity rounds and the telltale shimmer of a sniper's lens across a crowded plaza. In that world, invisibility was a weapon, not a choice. She had been trained to be the person no one looked at twice, the janitor, the courier, the waitress. She had walked through the high-security dens of Busan and the corporate towers of Seoul, a black woman navigating spaces that considered her an anomaly, using their prejudice as her primary shield. They never suspected that the woman clearing their glasses was cataloging the serial numbers on their weapons and the weaknesses in their security details. The transition back to civilian life had been a lie she told herself every morning. She had chosen this exclusive lounge in the city specifically because it was a place where important men came to be loud and invisible men came to be quiet. She wanted to stay off the grid, to bury the asset and let the waitress live in a world where the only stakes were the size of a tip. But as the red laser dot flickered against Li Gan's navy suit, the civilian veneer shattered. The muscle memory of 100 simulated extractions flooded back. Her heart rate slowed to a tactical calm, and the girl from nowhere realized that the shadows she had hidden in were no longer a refuge, but a vantage point. The training she tried to abandon was the only thing that would keep the restaurant from becoming a tomb. Maria forced her breathing into a rhythmic, tactical cycle, detaching her mind from Li Gan's continuing verbal assault. While he basked in the laughter of his subordinates, Maria's peripheral vision became a wide-angle lens, scanning the high-end lounge with the cold precision of a thermal sweep. She didn't look at the laser directly. Instead, she tracked its origin point by calculating the angle of reflection off the crystal wine glass standing inches from the MafiaBoss's hand. The math was instantaneous, a relic of her days as Asset 742, pointing her toward the back of the house. Her gaze swept past the heavy velvet curtains and the mahogany pillars, settling finally on the stainless steel expanse of the kitchen. To any other observer, the kitchen was a hive of culinary activity, obscured by the frosted glass of the swinging doors. But Maria's eyes locked onto the service slot, the narrow horizontal opening where the chefs slid finished plates for the waitstaff to collect. Amidst the steam and the frantic movement of white-coated cooks, there was a pocket of unnatural stillness. There, tucked into the deep shadow of the industrial heat lamps, was a kitchen ghost. Maria spotted the dull, matte black finish of a suppressed muzzle, barely protruding through the gap. It was a professional setup. The shooter was using the chaos of the dinner rush and the glare of the heat lamps as a visual cloak. The rifle didn't move, anchored by a steady hand that was waiting for the exact moment Li Gan leaned forward to take a bite, a move that would tighten the fabric of his suit and provide a static target over his heart. She noted the shooter's discipline. The laser wasn't shaking. It was a high-end tactical emitter, nearly invisible to the naked eye in this lighting, dancing only when Li Gan shifted his weight. Maria realized the staff in the kitchen were likely already neutralized or held at gunpoint, explaining why the usual clatter of pans had fallen into an eerie, rhythmic hum. The assassin had turned the very heart of the restaurant into a kill box. The arrogance of Li Gan's voice buzzed in her ear like a distant insect, his insults growing more creative as he felt he had successfully dominated the obedient waitress. He had no idea that the steam rising from the kitchen service slot wasn't from a hot meal, but was swirling around the cold steel of his executioner. Maria adjusted her grip on her serving tray, her muscles coiled like a spring. The time for observation was over, the window for action was closing with every breath the Mafia boss took. The laughter at the table reached a crescendo as Li Gan delivered a final, stinging remark about the lineage of people who serve for a living. His lieutenants leaned back, their faces twisted into smug masks of superiority, completely oblivious to the crimson bead of light now hovering perfectly still over their leader's left ventricle. Maria didn't hesitate. To the guards, it looked like a breach of protocol. To the sniper in the kitchen, it was a sudden obstruction of the target. She stepped into the kill zone, her body shielding the vital organs of the man who had spent the last 10 minutes trying to dismantle her soul. The air in the restaurant seemed to thin, turning into a vacuum of anticipation. As Maria leaned down, the scent of Li Gan's expensive whiskey and the cold metallic tang of his arrogance filled her senses. She didn't whisper as a servant would. She spoke with the low, resonant authority of a handler directing an asset in the field. Her lips were inches from his ear, her voice a sharp contrast to the soft jazz still playing in the background. Jigum. Jogiak, she murmured. The two words, meaning now. Sniper, hit Li Gan with the force of a physical blow. The formal, native-level Busuzan accent she utilized was so precise, so unexpected, that it bypassed his ego and struck directly at his survival instinct. Li Gan's eyes went wide, his mouth falling open in a silent gasp as the realization flooded his system, as seen in the image. The mockery died in his throat, replaced by a paralyzing chill as he finally felt the faint, unnatural heat of the laser reflecting off his skin through the fine silk of his shirt. The effect was instantaneous. The entire restaurant froze. The lieutenants, sensing the sudden shift in their boss's posture, reached instinctively for the weapons concealed beneath their jackets, their eyes darting between Maria and Li Gan. Forks remained suspended in mid-air at neighboring tables, and the clatter of the kitchen seemed to vanish into a deafening silence. In that singular moment, the power dynamic that had defined the evening was incinerated. The man who had called her a dog was now looking up at her with the raw, naked terror of a man who realized his life was held in the hands of the very woman he had just finished insulting. Maria didn't pull away, she remained leaned in, her gaze locked onto the kitchen service slot, waiting for the first hammer to fall. The stillness that followed Maria's whisper was not the silence of a quiet room, but the pressurized hush of a bomb's fuse burning down to the last millimeter. Li Gan's world, once a fortress of ego and expensive silk, had shrunk to the diameter of a red dot and the weight of the hand Maria now placed firmly on his shoulder. He remained paralyzed, his breath hitching in his throat as the sensory reality of her warning manifested against his skin. He could feel it now, the faint, prickling warmth of the laser's focal point resting directly over his heart, a phantom heat that felt like the kiss of death itself. His lieutenants were statues of confusion, their hands hovering near their waistbands, trapped in a lethal hesitation because they couldn't comprehend why their boss had suddenly turned into a man carved from ice. They saw the lowly bird leaning over him, but they couldn't hear the tactical assessment she was now providing under her breath. Li Gan looked up at Maria, and for the first time, he truly saw her. The submissive mask was gone, replaced by the steel-eyed clarity of a predator who had spotted a larger threat. He realized with a sickening jolt that his life was no longer protected by his guards or his name. It was protected solely by the physical obstruction of this woman's body. Every insult he had hurled, the jokes about her heritage, the slurs about her status, rotted in his mind. He was a lion in a cage, and the woman he had been poking through the bars was the only one holding the key. Maria's grip on his shoulder tightened, a silent command for him not to flinch. She was tracking the minute movements of the muzzle and the kitchen service slot, her body calibrated to the millimeter to remain in the way. Li Gan felt a drop of sweat slide down his temple, the salt stinging his eyes, but he didn't dare blink. He was finally aware that the tiny red light dancing on his chest was a countdown, and the obedient waitress was the only reason the timer hadn't reached 0. The stillness shattered not with a bang, but with the sharp, crystalline ring of a wine glass exploding inches from Li Gan's ear. Maria's internal clock, honed by years of ballistic training, moved faster than the speed of sound. Before the first shard of glass could even touch the white linen tablecloth, she acted with a violent, fluid grace that betrayed every ounce of her secret past. Her hand, previously resting on Li Gan's shoulder, clamped onto his collar, and with a strength that defied her slender frame, she wrenched the Mafia boss out of his chair. "Down," she commanded, her voice no longer a whisper but a weaponized roar. She tackled him mid-fall, her weight driving him into the carpeted floor just as a second suppressed round hissed through the space his head had occupied milliseconds before. Above them, the atmosphere of the high-end lounge dissolved into a cacophony of terror. The crystal chandeliers vibrated from the impact of the hidden rifle, and more glassware disintegrated, raining diamond-like splinters onto the stunned lieutenants. Li Gan hit the ground hard, his expensive suit gathering dust as Maria pinned him down, her body acting as a living shield. Around them, the chaos of grace took hold, while the rest of the room erupted in panicked screams and chairs scraping against marble. Maria remained a pocket of tactical silence. She didn't just hide, she calculated. Even with the weight of a terrified Mafia boss beneath her, her eyes were locked on the kitchen service slot, tracking the trajectory of the missed shots to ensure they were out of the sniper's revamped line of sight. The guards, finally breaking their paralysis, fumbled for their firearms, their movements clumsy compared to the raw, instinctive precision Maria had just displayed. Li Gan lay gasping for air, his face pressed against the floor, looking up at the woman who had just saved his life with a mixture of shock and burgeoning realization. The waitress he had mocked was now the commander of his survival, her movements a blur of lethal efficiency in the flickering light of the dying dinner service. The smell of gunpowder and expensive wine hung heavy in the air as Maria rose to a low crouch, her eyes never leaving the kitchen service slot. Li Gan's guards were flailing, their weapons drawn but their aim useless as they pointed at shadows and screamed over the din of fleeing socialites. They were muscle, trained for street fights and intimidation, but they were utterly blind to a long-range tactical engagement. Maria's voice cut through their panic like a whip, vibrating with the authority of a field commander. "Cease fire. You're hitting the upholstery, not the shooter," she barked in a dialect of Korean so commanding that the guards froze mid-motion, looking at the waitress in stunned obedience. She didn't wait for them to process her accent. She grabbed the nearest lieutenant by his lapel, hauling him close to the marble pillar. "He has the high ground in the kitchen. If you rush the door, you're dead," she stated, her tone cold and analytical. "Two of you move to the left service entrance. Stay low, beneath the counter line. You," she pointed to the largest guard, "suppress the service window with a 3-second burst on my signal. Don't aim to kill, aim to keep his head down." The guards, instinctively recognizing the presence of a superior tactician, moved without question. Maria's focus shifted back to the kitchen. She knew the kitchen ghost would be recalibrating, looking for a heat signature or a clear line of sight through the steam. She snatched a heavy silver serving tray from a nearby table, her mind calculating the reflection of the overhead lights. On her signal, the large guard opened fire, the deafening roar of his handgun drawing the sniper's attention. Simultaneously, Maria pivoted and hurled the tray toward the kitchen doors. As it spun through the air, it acted as a momentary flashbang, catching the light and creating a blinding glare in the sniper's optics. In those 3 seconds of distraction, the other 2 guards breached the side door according to her flanking maneuver. Maria didn't follow them. She remained with Lee gone, her hand on the hilt of a steak knife she had palmed from the floor. She watched the kitchen doors buckle as the confrontation moved inside, the muffled sounds of a struggle and a single, final shot echoing through the tile-walled interior. The laser dot on Lee Gon's chest vanished, leaving behind only the dim, amber glow of the lounge's dying lamps. Maria exhaled, a slow, controlled release of tension, as she felt the asset pull back into the shadows of her mind. The waitress was back, but the room belonged to her now. The silence that followed the final shot in the kitchen was heavier than the gunfire had been. In the dim, amber light of the wrecked lounge, Maria slowly stood up, brushing the dust of the fine Persian rug from her red apron with a clinical, detached calm. Beside her, Lee Gon remained on the floor for a heartbeat longer, his hands trembling as he pushed himself into a seated position. The man who had entered the room as a sun around which all things orbited was now just a man covered in the shards of his own broken wine glasses. He looked around the room, at his guards, who were standing over the neutralized assassin in the kitchen, and then back at Maria. The red laser dot was gone, but the phantom heat of it seemed to have burned away his arrogance. His navy suit was ruined, but the realization in his eyes was sharper than any insult he had hurled earlier. He watched her as she picked up a fallen cloth to wipe a smear of Lee Gon's own spilled Bordeaux from her hand, her movements fluid and devoid of the obedient subservience he had mocked. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice cracking, the formal Korean he had used as a weapon now replaced by a raw, guttural sincerity. He didn't look at her as a waitress anymore. He looked at her with the terror and awe of a man who had seen a ghost return to life. He realized that every word of scorn he had spat at her had been heard by a woman who could have let him die with a simple tilt of her head. His life didn't belong to his empire or his bloodline tonight, it belonged to her. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been annihilated. Lee Gon reached out, not to command her, but as if to steady himself against the sheer force of her presence. The lowly bird had proven to be the only creature in the room with the talents to protect him. For the first time in his life, the Mafia boss bowed his head in a silent, staggering admission of a debt that could never be paid in cash, a debt of blood. Maria looked down at him, her face a mask of iron and shadow, and for a moment, the restaurant felt less like a lounge and more like a throne room where the crown had just changed heads. The lounge was a tomb of shattered glass and cooling steam, the soft jazz still playing from the speakers a haunting contrast to the carnage on the floor. Maria began to untie her red apron, the fabric stained with the wine and soot of a life she was now shedding like a second skin. Her hands were steady, her heart rate returning to the low, rhythmic hum of a machine at rest. She had spent years trying to bury the soldier beneath the waitress, but the kitchen ghost had forced the asset back into the light. The invisibility she had cherished was gone, burned away by the flash of a muzzle and the 2 words she had whispered into the ear of a king. Li Gan stood slowly, his movements lacking their former predatory grace. He adjusted his ruined navy jacket, but he didn't look at his guards as they emerged from the kitchen, dragging the remains of the threat. His eyes were fixed solely on Maria. The man who had entered the lounge as a tyrant now stood as an initiate. He walked toward her, stepping over the debris of his own arrogance, and stopped just outside her personal space, a boundary he now respected with a newfound, trembling reverence. "You said I was the only dog in this restaurant," he began, his voice low and devoid of the seasonal cruelty that had defined his earlier tirade. He didn't speak in the formal Heoche to demean her, he spoke with the raw, direct honesty of a man making a pact. "You were right. I was blind to the power standing right in front of me. A woman with your eyes, your tongue, and your steel, you don't belong behind a serving tray." He reached into his pocket and produced a heavy, gold-embossed card, placing it on the only clean section of the marble bar. "The life you were hiding from is over, Maria Blue. I don't want a waitress. I want a guardian. I want the ghost who sees the red dots before they touch my heart." He didn't offer her a tip, he offered her a seat at the head of a different kind of table. Maria looked at the card, then up at the man who had been her tormentor and was now her ward. She realized that the quiet life she had chased was merely a slow death. The shadows of Payu and Busan were calling her back, but this time, she wouldn't be a hidden asset for a faceless government. She would be the power behind the throne. Without a word, Maria picked up the card and tucked it into her pocket. She walked past Li Gan, her gait shifting into the confident, lethal stride of a woman who had reclaimed her name. As she pushed through the heavy mahogany doors and stepped into the cooling rain of the city, she didn't look back. The waitress was dead, and the new contract had just begun.
Thank you for watching till the end. Your time means a lot to us. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You are valued here. See you in the next video.